This is the Bluegrass Debate Coalition. We also go by the name BDC. This is the BDC Guest Lecture Series. I'm your host, Bill Eddy, and today we are joined with our subject matter expert, Professor Shane Hadden from the University of Kentucky. The discussion today is going to be U.S. regulation of cryptocurrency. More specifically, the talk is going to be about cryptocurrency, and the format is going to be as follows. We will start with a 10 to 15 minute lecture from our subject matter expert. Then I will question the expert for a few minutes, and then we will turn it over to the students to ask their questions and get answers from Professor Hadden. So before we begin, I would just like to introduce our guest lecturer. Professor Shane Hadden is currently Deputy Chair in the Finance Department at the Gatton College of Business at the University of Kentucky. He was educated at Georgetown, where he received his MBA and his doctorate in law, and he currently teaches financial technology to the students at University of Kentucky. He is a certified financial analyst and a certified Bitcoin professional. So, Professor Hadden, I thank you very much for being here, and I would appreciate it if you would go ahead and engage us with your lecture.
All right. So, as Bill said, I teach finance at UK. I teach a class on financial technology, which includes a big component of the class is cryptocurrency. This is a very broad topic that can go pretty deep into technology. I'm going to try to keep it fairly high level and focus on what I think are the most important elements of this that you really need to understand before, as preparation for debating the regulatory implications of this. I'm going to focus primarily on Bitcoin. Cryptocurrency is, there are thousands of cryptocurrencies, but it all started with Bitcoin. And I personally believe, and others do as well, that Bitcoin is really the most important and the one that will be around, regardless of what happens to others. I'm going to talk about why Bitcoin was invented. Talk about the important terms that I think you really have to know in order to debate this. Talk about the benefits and costs of Bitcoin. And then talk about kind of what are these other 2,000 coins that are out there, what has been developed beyond Bitcoin, and then talk about some regulatory issues, what the various issues are, and the options for approaching regulation. So to start, this is the most important part of this lecture, I believe. Most people, when they talk about Bitcoin, don't really appreciate, and in my experience, I've seen regulators debate, and it's often the question, why do we have Bitcoin? What's the purpose of Bitcoin? And a lot of people can't explain it, even in congressional, sessions. So this is the purpose of Bitcoin. Prior to Bitcoin was invented in 2008, so not that long ago, 13 years ago. It was invented in the middle of the financial crisis that was going on back in 2008, 2009. The financial crisis was, of course, a banking crisis. Before the invention of Bitcoin, it was impossible to pay people to move money without a bank being involved, okay? And by moving money, what I'm talking about is moving digital money. And today, practically all money is digital. Some people pay with physical dollar bills, but most transactions are, over the internet, and everything over the internet, of course, is digital. And with digital money, what has happened is we used to be able to simply, when you went to buy something, you would take your cash, pay the seller would hand you the good, you would hand the cash over, and nobody else needed to be involved in the transaction. With digital payments, and you can see this picture here, if you're selling something and somebody gives you their credit card, you're not gonna just hand over the good until you know that the payment is valid. And the only way to know that prior to Bitcoin was to have a bank as part of the transaction, and you would ping the bank and the bank would say, yep, that's a good, the money is there, you can deliver the good. That works, it works really well, but for a lot of people believe that we need to be able to pay each other without banks. We need to be able to be our own bank. We need to conduct commerce, at least have the option to, without these banks in the middle. We shouldn't have to put our money in a bank. It's a nice option, but there should be an alternative to that. So that's pretty difficult actually to do, because how are you going to, how are we, people all over the world paying each other online? How do you know if that other person is actually has the money to pay you, or isn't? Even if you knew, even if you had a picture of their bank account right when they were paying you, how do you know that they're not going to pay two people at the same time? It's called the double spending problem. Banks can solve that, but what if we don't want banks? That's what this pseudonymous person, Satoshi Nakamoto, solved in 2008. Satoshi Nakamoto is not a real person. You all probably may have learned that by now. But he came up with this invention that creates an alternative way to pay each other without intermediation. I'm going to simplify it to three parts. One is you create a distributed network of computers that have the same record of all the transactions that are happening in the network. You cryptographically lock the record so that that record can never be changed and everybody has it. And then that actually existed before Bitcoin. What Satoshi invented was the last thing, is a system for validating, to making sure that the transactions that go into the record are actually valid. And that is this proof of work consensus algorithm, they call it. I'm not going to go into detail there. We can, if you want, in the Q&A. I have a couple of slides on it, but what you should know is, at this point, is that problem was solved in 2008, and that is Bitcoin, the payment network Bitcoin. I want to lay out several terms that you really have to know if you're going to be talking about this space. Decentralization is everything. That's the main goal of cryptocurrency, is to create platforms that are not governed by any single entity or person. So with Bitcoin, there's no ability of any single point in this network that can shut it down. It is decentralized. There's no central, like banking is very centralized. You're relying on the bank, you're relying on the government to facilitate your payments. Bitcoin, on the other hand, is decentralized. There is no central agency that's making it happen, so you're not reliant on them. Sound money is another term that you'll hear a lot. Bitcoin is referred to as sound money because it can't be printed by a government. So with normal currencies that you know about, the dollar, the yen, the euro, those can actually be simply printed by, like the US Treasury can physically print dollars. And that can inflate the money. And so if you have dollars and the government prints dollars, the dollars that you have will be worth less. We're not so concerned about that in the US, but in a lot of countries, for example, it happened fairly recently in Zimbabwe. If that happens, and the government might want to do that to make it easier to pay their debts, they just print the money to pay the debt. What happens is that's good for some people in the government, but it's really bad for anybody that is trying to save money because their money becomes worthless. That can't happen with Bitcoin because there's a limited amount of Bitcoin that will ever be created. It's 21 million Bitcoin that will ever be created. You can't create more. The cryptography of Bitcoin, all this is made possible by cryptography. It can get pretty complicated, but there's two words that you really have to know. Hashing. Hashing is this process of turning any amount of information into a string of characters that if you look at the string of characters, you don't know what the input is. But if you have the string of characters, you can prove that you knew the input by putting the input in again, and it'll create the output. Hashes are extremely important. Every time you sign into Instagram or somewhere and put your password in, that's what is saved in the database of the platform is the hash of your password. They don't know your password. That hashing is, they call it the workhorse of cryptography. It's used everywhere, very important in the Bitcoin network. Also, asymmetric encryption is something you will learn about, or you may have heard about. You really need to kind of get your head around this. It used to be the case that all encryption, and encryption is turning plain text into some sort of encrypted text that you can't read, so nobody can stand in the middle and read your messages. It used to be the case that you would encrypt a message and then decrypt the message with the same key. That's a problem on the internet, because how do you get the key to somebody on the other side of the world? If you need symmetric encryption, that doesn't work, right? Because you can't send, there's no way to send it. And so in the 80s, early 80s, there was this asymmetric encryption. And that now allows for you to encrypt with one key, decrypt with another key, called the public key and the private key. You can post your public key and say, this is my public key. And in the case of Bitcoin, that's what a Bitcoin address is a public key. And you can prove that you are the owner of that address with the private key, but those are two different keys. Can't go into much more detail on that. We can a little bit if you want to later, but those are the two primary cryptography areas that you need to know about if to really understand Bitcoin. You'll hear the term mining and proof of work. What mining is actually, in the case of Bitcoin, it is coming up with a hash that meets certain characteristics. And that is necessary because that is what serves to kind of lock the record and actually validate that all the transactions are valid. Last thing, a lot of people get confused about this. There are two Bitcoins actually. There is the Bitcoin blockchain, which is a payment method, is similar like Visa, right? If you're familiar with Visa or MasterCard, just a payment system. Bitcoin, big B, payment system. And then Bitcoin, the currency, which is the most important thing, is Bitcoin little b. I can pay you in Bitcoin little b without using the Bitcoin blockchain. So that's really important to understand. So if people say Bitcoin is slow, Bitcoin is expensive, they're talking about the payment system. They're not talking about the currency itself. All right, I think I'm probably a little bit, I need to speed it up as far as time. But let's talk about, I've explained kind of what it is. Let me now talk about benefits and costs of Bitcoin. The benefits of Bitcoin, and they're very important globally for society, is that people can control their own money. Money, of course, is of utmost importance to people because that's what their sustenance is provided with, their ability to spend freely. And so people need control of their money, and at least an option, right? It's nice to have your money in safekeeping with the bank, but it's also nice to be able to take it out if you want and still be able to spend, especially in countries unlike the US that have less rule of law and less certainty of the banking system. Banking is arguably inefficient. Anytime there's intermediaries in a series of transactions, that can create inefficiencies because everybody needs to get paid. So if you take out an intermediary, it's probably the case that the system is going to be more efficient. So Bitcoin creates more efficiencies in that respect. Sound money, like I said, with Bitcoin, a government cannot simply print the money physically. And another benefit of not having to go through a bank is privacy, and that can be a benefit and a cost. The people that argue against Bitcoin, one big one is that it uses enormous amounts of power. The average power required for Bitcoin for a year is that of the country of Finland. So enormous amounts of power, and that power is used in the mining process. So this is a picture of a mining operation. All of these computers, all they're doing is hashing, is doing a hash function in a computer in order to mine Bitcoin. So enormously expensive in terms of environment. Of course, people that believe in the importance of Bitcoin say, well, that needs to be weighed against the benefit of Bitcoin, right? What would the efficiencies be? What would the savings of power be if we didn't have banks, right? There's pluses and minuses, but it is a very high cost to the environment to have the proof of work algorithm as it is. Less control of money supply by the government. If you're the government, you might not like Bitcoin, especially some governments wouldn't like Bitcoin because they would lose the ability to control the money supply. If you are a government that is not really creditworthy, especially, you can't control the money supply. The US, I think, could control the money supply even with Bitcoin. I can explain that later, but that is a problem. And then from the government's perspective, again, the ability to monitor transactions, the ability to prevent money laundering, to prevent terrorist activities. Bitcoin does make that harder. All right, so big picture again, controversy. Some people love Bitcoin. Bitcoin's value is now at about $1.2 trillion. So clearly there are a lot of people around the world who believe that Bitcoin is digital gold, right? Which is reasonable to think. Gold is just a element, right? It's just something sitting there, but we all believe that it is very valuable because it can be used as a currency. Bitcoin is pretty much the same. We like gold because it's never tarnished. People like Bitcoin now because over the last 13 years, it's never failed. So market cap of Bitcoin is now 1.2 trillion. Gold, I believe, is around 10 trillion. So people believe that that gap is going to close. On the other hand, a lot of people think that it's absolutely insane to even talk about cryptocurrency. It's crazy to invest in cryptocurrency. It's crazy to think that cryptocurrency might at one point be, someday be a global currency. People like Warren Buffett refer to cryptocurrency as rat poison squared. That's a quote from Warren Buffett. And of course, Warren Buffett is brilliant, right? So a lot of smart people, think that Bitcoin is very bad. A lot of smart people think that Bitcoin is very good. That's why you'll be having this debate about how to potentially regulate it. So Bitcoin was launched in 2008, or was created in 2008, launched in 2009. And all Bitcoin is software. So when you think of cryptocurrency, you can think this is just software currency, right? It's just there's people that write the code, there's people that update the code. It's software. Because of that, there's been a lot of replication of these platforms. And one thing that's really interesting about cryptocurrency, unlike a physical dollar bill, like a dollar bill, you can use it to buy something. You could also write on it. You could write on a dollar bill. You could write a coupon on a dollar bill. You could write a joke. You could do anything like that. But there's only so much space on a dollar bill. If you have a currency that's written in code, there's no limit to how much additional functionality you can have in that currency, right? And that's what has been developed, right? So they use the decentralized, functionality of Bitcoin. Bitcoin really just does nothing. It just sits there, and it's a really nice currency because it does nothing. But what has evolved are currencies that actually do have utility. They actually do more than just sit there like gold, right? It may be a ticket for, to ride a train. It might represent a contract that's being executed. It might represent ownership of an artwork, like if you've heard of NFTs, or ownership of a video on, an NBA video of LeBron James dunking, right? That might be represented in a coin, in a token. So you may have heard of these non-fungible tokens. Ethereum is a platform you may have heard of. This was created in 2016, initiated in 2013, 2014, to basically create these new currencies. And as you can see in this small little graphic here, this is just a small portion of literally thousands and thousands of currencies that have been created to do various different things. All right, so what are the regulatory issues that you all might be prompted to debate? Well, one of them is, should a government be concerned and pass regulation that somehow limits the currency simply because the government needs to control the money supply? Control of the money supply by the Federal Reserve in the US is why we have a stable currency. It's why we are able to kind of shorten recessions. The government is able to inject money into the system, pull it back out. And if they can't do that, then they will not have the ability to create a good, stable economy. Impact on the banking system. If the banks are disintermediated, what's going to happen? Are we going to have a bunch of runs on the banks? Are these banks, what if the banks start disappearing? Is that going to be a safety and soundness issue? Are they going to default? That's a concern. Criminal use of cryptocurrencies. So without question, there are a lot of criminals using Bitcoin. There's ransom taken by Bitcoin. There's terrorists that use Bitcoin. There's all types of bad folks using Bitcoin. There's a question of how effective it is, but that is a question. Does the government need to either restrict it or somehow require disclosures in order to prevent that? A big one is investor protection. Bitcoin is extremely volatile. A lot of these other coins that are being created are fraudulent. They're not even real, but they are being used in speculative markets. There's a lot of manipulation. There's a lot of investors that are losing a lot of money. And just like the stock market, the securities regulators are very interested in kind of mitigating the risk of investors being hurt. Tax, right? You can, with Bitcoin, if you want to break the law, right? You're breaking the law, but if you wanted to break the law, it's a tool. It's something you can do to hide money from the tax authorities. Just like you could do with cash, right? Physical cash, you can hide it. So if you want to break the law, you could do that with Bitcoin. And so the tax regulators are very interested in potentially increasing regulation. And then finally, the environmental costs. So the government may be interested in regulating it to simply mitigate the damage, reduce the damage to the environment because of the power that's created. So what might they do? Well, the US could outlaw it. Bitcoin has been outlawed in several countries, simply saying no one can own it, can trade it, can mine it, can do anything related to Bitcoin, or that's a criminal violation. They could do that. I don't think they will. No major kind of Western country has done that. They could just make it more difficult to use, right? Just intentionally do things that make it difficult. They could, on the other hand, they could make it easier to do, right? They could allow banks to issue accounts in Bitcoin. That would be nice. There are countries that have done that. Requiring licenses. This is something that they're already doing, where to be transact, to be an exchange, for example, you might need a license. So in New York State, if you want to be an exchange in New York State, you have to get licensed as a Bitcoin exchange. There's a question about, okay, if you're going to regulate, how do you do it? Do you tack it on to the banking system, the banking regulators that we already have, the Fed and the comptroller and that kind of thing? Do you put it within the SEC that regulates securities? Do you put it within the CFTC that regulates commodities? Or do you just create some new regulatory body, agency to specifically regulate cryptocurrency? That's another question. Required reporting. So in the infrastructure bill that they're talking about, there is a provision about if you are a broker in cryptocurrencies, you have to report the activity to the IRS. I want to leave you with a couple of kind of bigger picture, what if things that could go wrong with Bitcoin, lack of Bitcoin regulation or over-regulation, or not simply not taking it seriously. This is a kind of a pet issue with me, and I think it's really, really important. The Bitcoin has gone from being worth 0 to being worth 1.2 trillion. A lot of people have become richer by this, right? $1.2 trillion richer. If Bitcoin becomes a global currency, it will continue to go up and up and up in value. If that happens, and the US and in the future, citizens of the US need to buy Bitcoin need to acquire Bitcoin to just pay for groceries, we're going to have to buy in at a very, very high price. And so if it is going to be the case that in the future, Bitcoin is going to be adopted globally, we're going to potentially miss out and be made poorer relative to other countries that do adopt Bitcoin earlier. Because if you adopt it early, then you participate in the increase in value of the currency. Whereas if you're late, you actually lose that. So that is a real concern of mine, is the degree to which the value of Bitcoin's creation is distributed equitably around the world versus some people, profiting immensely while others aren't able to. So that's what scares me about regulators dismissing Bitcoin, because they do so at our potential cost. Okay, that's where I will leave this, and I'll open it up to questions.
So thank you for the lecture. I took a lot of notes here. And in fact, I'd like to touch upon the last thing that we talked about with regard to this loss of opportunity that comes from joining or participating too late. Do you think it's possible that the lack of regulation or over-regulation that you referred to might lead to, might be caused by a lack of understanding of the technology? And because of a lack of understanding, we might end up creating regulations that not only fail to be effective, but also force us to miss out on this early adoption that you're talking about. Do you mind commenting? Just it is your pet peeve. Can you talk about how their lack of understanding contributes to the desire to do something or not do something, and therefore the consequence?
Yeah, we're scared of what we don't understand, and Bitcoin is complicated. There's no question about it. Regulators do not understand it. Some do, but most simply don't. They think they understand it, and if they took the time to learn about, you need to take some time to learn about cryptocurrency, to learn about how Bitcoin works, and appreciate that software actually can be used to create something like gold, an actual currency, and understand that it really isn't whatever. If you don't understand it, you might think the worst. You may think that it is potentially manipulatable by some other entity, but it's not. And if you understand the software, if the regulators were to understand that, I think they would be more comfortable with it. Another thing about understanding, this is what I did not touch on this, but there's both complicated cryptography and there's complicated finance here as well. Bitcoin, a lot of people confuse Bitcoin, the payment service, with Bitcoin, the currency. Bitcoin, the currency, can exist without Bitcoin, the payment system. And the US could, in fact, regulate the supply of Bitcoin through the same measures that they regulate the supply of the US dollar, with bank reserve levels and things like this. And it's just not, it's not appreciated, or this is, I guess, cynical. It is understood, but the banking system, there is a great deal of inertia, or people. There's a lot of people that don't want the banking system to change, and they are lobbyists, of course, and they will talk in terms of Bitcoin being dangerous because that's their benefit. Want to be disintermediated. So there's a lot of challenges to getting the right answer in the regulatory system.
Okay. And I just wanted to follow up then, because that's interesting, the cynical, because that's right where my mind went. So the same people who have the lack of understanding, are they going to be the ones writing these regulations? In other words, will the lawmakers involve people that really have the expertise, or is this potentially more for show? They have a political agenda, so they're going to write regulations that just kind of fit the status quo anyway? Your prediction about who's going to write these regulations?
And that's interesting. You say who's going to write the regulations. So there's the laws that are passed, for example, in the infrastructure bill, and then it is handed down to the Treasury Department to write the actual regulations. So the Treasury regulations that are more detailed than the statutes that are passed in Congress really is where the rubber meets the road as far as regulations. So the infrastructure bill may say a broker has to report, activity to the IRS. The Treasury decides what a broker is, right? So if a law is just a broker, a lot of people are worried, does that mean the software designers, are they brokers? Are the miners brokers? Who's brokering these transactions? Supposedly they say the Treasury is going to write, is more sympathetic to the cryptocurrency marketplace, and will soften anything that is in the law itself.
All right. I want to switch gears a little bit to some of the environmental impact that you mentioned. It was a really interesting graphic that you showed of that data mining, the hashing that was going on that you referred to. And so I guess I want to ask, will US regulation have much of an impact environmentally, considering the fact that would be a US regulation, but if someone were to offshore their mining, then wouldn't that be free of the US regulation and thereby continue to see the environment suffer, or the amount of energy continue to be used for this mining purpose, for the hashing?
Yeah, it would be very difficult for the US to dramatically reduce in the long run Bitcoin's progress. It can be mined. Miners are set up where there's cold weather, cheap power, and government stability. For a long time, that was China, actually. China's now cracking down on it more. Iceland is a big place for mining. I actually just learned that Iran is mining 5% of just for profit. They don't like it, but they're just used doing it. So yeah, the US unilaterally cannot stop Bitcoin from if consumers want Bitcoin, if the value proposition to consumers is strong enough, and it is globally, that's the point of decentralization. There is no ability for any one party to reduce the usage. And what's important is that is exactly why Bitcoin was created. And so when there is a threat to Bitcoin, that validates the need for Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Right. And so we've seen this for the last 10 years. China will do something to try to shut it down, and then it just, okay, we really need it because the government's
Conflict with the
right?
government. Yeah, that's right.
So, and another thing about governmental, reaction to this is Bitcoin can be decentralized. If you do it wrong, it can also be very centralized, because the blockchain that is used to record these transactions is a surveillance tool. So if you have a centralized version of a digital-based currency, you actually have more control over your your populace's activities than if you had your traditional currency. So a lot of countries like China, when they say we want to create our own digital currency, they don't want to create a decentralized currency. They want to create a very centralized currency that is built for surveillance. It's bad.
And then let me ask you in the follow-up on that same light, how much of an impact do you think the US regulations will have on criminal use? Would it be the same story that you just said? Could you modify the story you just told about how, because of the decentralized nature, that criminals will still find a way? But I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm interested to know, will US regulations have an impact on the amount of crime and perhaps human trafficking and who knows, some of the most awful things that Bitcoin pays for?
It's horrible. I think Bitcoin itself, the FBI and the regulators are able to de-anonymize who's using it pretty effectively. There are other coins that are actually more suitable for anonymous transactions. A lot of kind of criminals that don't really, they're using Bitcoin and then they get caught, because the thing about Bitcoin is it is a public ledger of all the transactions. You're using a pseudonym, username and address, but if you pay somebody else with that Bitcoin and the government knows who you paid, then they can find out that you're the one that just bought that Lamborghini or whatever it is right? Mm-hmm. And for the last, I guess, 7 or 8 years, ever since the Silk Road, there was this big kind of drug operation that was completely dismantled by the FBI going into the Bitcoin blockchain and just de-anonymizing all the transactions, all the addresses that were not all of them, but so the degree to which it is used for criminality versus the good, I think is overstated. It definitely is being used, but every major invention, so when you think about automobiles, when you think about electricity, the first big users are the criminals. You got, bootleggers driving around in fast cars. You have people, of course, they're going to use the technology. That doesn't mean that the technology is bad, right? It's actually because it is so good is why they are using it. So we have to remember that, I think. Okay.
And then there's another concept that I learned when I was in business school that I think is perhaps appropriate here. The assertion is that you're the first to market and you're going to gain a lot from being the first, but eventually perhaps give way to the best in the market, the people who do it best. Yeah. So my question is, will Bitcoin kind of retain, its prominence? Is it going to start to give way to maybe someone better? In other words, will we be talking about someone else 10 years from now the way we talk about Bitcoin today?
Yeah, that was a great question. Thank you. In business school, they call it second mover advantage, or, the pioneers get the arrows in the backs. So the answer is, my belief is Bitcoin is first, but it's also extremely unique in that we don't know who invented Bitcoin. If that is a mystery, there's a lot of mythical or mythological kind of value built around Bitcoin that makes it have staying power. It's different from anything else. The only reason that Bitcoin has value is that it is decentralized. And so if the criteria for success is how decentralized the currency is, you can't have Google come and create a better currency, right? Because that is inherently centralized. You can't have the US government create a better currency. You have to recreate somehow the magic that goes into creating this ecosystem that has been built for the last 13 years that is decentralized, because it's so spread out and so many users of so many different types and so many different countries. That's what you would have to do better. And I don't see any formula for getting there. And part of the magic is that we don't know who created it. And I don't think we ever will. So I'm skeptical that there will ever be a better Bitcoin, to be this. There is that second mover advantage, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Okay, so I'm Ekantika Sami. I go to Musique Middle School and I'm in 7th grade. So my question was, when I'm looking through all of these all this information that's given to me, I'm seeing a lot of stuff not a lot, but some stuff about Switzerland and their reputation for having some sort of crypto friendly nation, and they had some sort of 50 blockchain companies, and I was quite confused on what happened there. So what exactly happened, or what did they do?
Great question. So there's two things about Switzerland that you may or may not know. They have a history of neutrality. Just going back, through the wars in the past, they've been able to kind of maintain this, neutrality, or not being aligned with any other countries. And because of that, they're thought of as kind of a safe place to put your money, because they're not going to be caught up in wars. And so they've become a banking center. I actually used to work for a company called Credit Suisse, one of the largest banks in the world. And so Switzerland is a banking center, and it also has this history of neutrality. So they and consistent with that, their policies around cryptocurrency have been fairly kind of enabling, not irresponsible, but they've invited the folks that are creating the new currencies into Switzerland, and created environments that are very kind of pro development of new ideas in crypto. There's not, when you have a new technology like cryptocurrency, you can kind of, uncertainty stifles innovation. And if a country comes out and says, you know what, we're going to create a little sandbox. You can come here, you can work, you can innovate. And even if we don't know necessarily that it's gonna violate our current laws, that's okay. We'll provide a little safe place to innovate. And that's one of the things that I believe they have done. I wish the US would do that more. So yeah, what you said is correct. A lot of folks create their foundations in Switzerland and actually physically have their developers there, because it's a safe place to innovate.
Professor Hadden, may I follow up on your answer?
Yeah, of course.
What do you think the chances are that these regulations, based on what we're reading about the motivation for why, how might that affect innovation in this market?
Yeah, regulation, uncertainty stifles innovation more than anything. And so in some ways, regulation could actually make the process easier, because people are scared, right? Nobody wants to break the law. So if the rules are uncertain, then it's hard to innovate. So you can have really draconian regulation that just shuts everything down. Of course, that's not going to be good for innovation. But if it is clarifying, that is a good thing. So Coinbase, which is the largest company, the largest public company in the US at least, in the crypto space, they are advocating for a crypto regulator. So instead of trying to staple it to the SEC or banking regulators. Have a regulator that understands, importantly, like we were talking about, actually understands crypto and can regulate it in an informed way. That would be good in their mind for cryptocurrency. And I agree. I mean, it's not going to be, it wouldn't be good for the bad guys, but a little bit of regulation can help, smooth the path for innovation.
Hi, my name is Nishida, and I go to Mazik Middle School, and I'm in 7th grade. And my question was about mining cryptocurrency. So when I researched the topic, I saw a lot about how mining affected the environment, but I didn't really fully understand what it meant. So what does it mean to mine cryptocurrency?
Sure. So when you mine cryptocurrency, what you're doing is you're solving a puzzle. There is something called a hash function, which is a mathematical function. It's a cryptographic function that basically comes up with, that takes a certain amount of information and creates a output of a certain length that if you look at it, you don't know the input. That's the purpose of these hash functions. And importantly, this is just it's a computer function. Like, when you do something on your computer, inside the computer, it's a bunch of ones and zeros, and there's some algorithm working, right? And even if you put 1 + 1 into a computer, there's a lot of operations that are required to come up with the number 2, right? This function that I'm talking about is much more complicated than 1 + 1. It's a really a computer function that requires a lot of computing power. And if you solve this puzzle first, you get a lot of money. So if you find the hash that the software has asked you to find first, so there's thousands of people in the world trying to find this hash, this number, and they're using their computers to find it. And the one that finds it first gets about $400,000 right now. Okay, and so if you can solve a math problem with a computer and earn $400,000, what are you going to do? You're going to get a really big, really fast computer, so you can solve that first, right? And that's what people are doing. They're getting these computers that only do this one mathematical exercise over and over and over again every day. And these big rooms of computers, of course, computers require power to operate. And that's why, that's why it's bad for the environment, because everybody is instead of using that power for housing and other things, they're using it to simply do this mathematical function. And it's not ideal, but it is necessary for Bitcoin to work. To be decentralized, we have to basically use this power.
So my question was, I've come across this term a lot when reading about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin in general. So what does the cryptocurrency bubble exactly mean?
Things tend to have a fundamental value, a value that people recognize as being having utility versus the price. So when the price, sometimes assets just start to have a life of their own. And the price just keeps going up because people are confident that somebody else will buy it from you. So it really doesn't matter what the fundamental value is, so long as you could sell it to somebody else. That's what creates bubbles. And then eventually people don't think that there's going to be buyers anymore, and that's when it pops. So the hard part of thinking about that with Bitcoin is, how do you think about the fundamental value of Bitcoin? There's a lot of debate about that. some people think that there actually is significant fundamental value, just like there's fundamental value in gold, right? Whereas other people think that you can't have like Warren Buffett would say, you can't have a currency that is not supported by the government, that governments create currencies.
And how exactly will like Bitcoin impact like if it ever does go global, like you mentioned before? How will it impact a country's ability to collect like income tax?
Well, so again, there's Bitcoin, the currency, and Bitcoin, the payment system. We could have, you and I could transact in Bitcoin in a way that is like a Visa card, right? You can have Visa cards that are denominated in Bitcoin. Just like you can have a credit card that is euros, you can have a credit card that is yen, you can have a credit card that is Bitcoin. And that goes through the same Visa networks and everything else as dollars. That can be tracked, you know, as is done with, you know, today. So you say, well, if we're doing that, why do we need Bitcoin? Well, you need it because there's always the option to go down and get the Bitcoin out of those payment systems and have it directly. And that's not what's possible today. So that's one thing. But another is, you know, it's criminality is important to stop, but you can reduce it in other ways. And Bitcoin, if everybody's using Bitcoin, there's going to be more ability to de-anonymize. It's not going to be as, you know, it's not going to be the haven for criminal activity that it is today. If it is actually a global currency that countries are actually sponsoring, like the US could sponsor Bitcoin as a currency. The US could have its banks issue Bitcoin denominated deposits. The US, and this is kind of a complicated concept, but the US, most currency is synthetic currency. It's not real currency. When a bank takes your money and then lends it to others, it is multiplying the amount of currency in the market. You know, the US could create Bitcoin that way, synthetic Bitcoin. And so this idea of a global currency, it's simply, you know, incrementally, the difference is none of these countries would be able to print it. The credit-worthy companies would be able to monitor or adjust the value of it, but they just wouldn't be able to print it to inflate it. It could potentially all go through the banking system with the same benefits to the IRS. So the fear of, well, we can't have a global currency being Bitcoin because how are we going to tax people? First of all, most people are taxpayers. Most people don't commit fraud, right? We're only talking about the fringe, like tax evaders. There's always going to be tax evaders, right? So but the benefit of having a global currency is enormous. All the efficiencies of not having to exchange one currency for another is enormous. The not having fluctuating currency rates and the uncertainty that causes for multinational businesses is very beneficial. The breaking down of artificial national boundaries, right? A lot of national boundaries are actually, you know, they're not the boundaries of cultures. They're simply straight lines drawn 100 years ago by, you know, various powers. And they're artificial, but they're maintained by things like currencies. And if you had one currency, it can serve to kind of break those artificial lines that cause wars. So that was a little bit more than what you asked.
Yeah, well, thank you.
There is something that maybe you could touch upon just for a moment. What about remittances? When people are sending money to their families at home, is this global currency idea, or just the idea of using a Bitcoin as part of that, does that save them real money? Is that something, or is that more of a possibility, but not a reality for remittances, for people being able to try to get a cheaper way of sending money home?
Yeah, if you have a way to convert the Bitcoin into your local currency, then absolutely you can send it across border without any intermediation. So all the fees that are involved are non-existent. If your functional currency is Bitcoin, of course, then there's no transaction slippage, right? If you're actually using Bitcoin in your daily life, then one family member is in the U.S. and another family member is in the Philippines, and you're both using Bitcoin, then yes, absolutely, that would be the cheapest method of sending money back home. Now you got convert.
Let me follow up on that and just say, but do you think the regulations would impact the remittance that people are paying? Like the regulations would add some sort of extra cost onto these exchanges or whatever, to the point where now I was not paying, but now I am paying a higher some sort of fee because regulations led to that?
Possibly. Regulations almost always increase, especially regulations that require reporting, require a lot of compliance, possibly over unnecessary requirements, but that costs a lot. And so, yes, that would be added to the cost of transferring. So it could eliminate the benefit.
Hello, my name's Angini. I go to school at Case Creek Middle School, and I'm in 7th grade. So I had a question which you might have cleared at the beginning, but I didn't quite catch it. Is Bitcoin, I heard you talk about how Bitcoin was like mined. So is it some type of material somewhere, or is it like coded in virtual mining?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. It is all code. So the term mining probably confuses a lot of people because it's compared to gold, and of course gold is mined physically. Bitcoin is, don't get confused with that term, the act of validating a transaction, right? That's really what's happening, is transactions are being validated by a process in which when you put when you do a Bitcoin transaction, when you send a message out onto the Bitcoin blockchain, there are tens of thousands of nodes that get this message, and nobody knows whether those transactions are valid or not, right? And so somebody has to be responsible for checking and playing the role of the bank. Yes, this transaction is valid. So how's that going to be done? Well, the way it's done is transactions go out on the internet, and miners, these people that I'm talking about that have these big computers, the way the software is written is, if you go out and you find 1 megabyte worth of transaction data, right? So all these transactions are like, I'm paying you 1 Bitcoin. That's put out there as a message that has a certain amount of size. So what the miners do is they gather messages that are valid. They make sure that the messages are valid. Then they take that, the bits that are in those messages, combine it. Well, they hash that. Remember I was telling you about this hash function? This is getting a little technical, but I think it's important. They put that information into this hash function, and you should look this up if you don't know what a hash function is. It's just like a exponent or something. It's just a function that a computer has, that they apply this information, put that information into the function, and they get an output, which is a hash. And they look at the hash, and the Bitcoin blockchain is telling them, if you get a hash that starts with 5 zeros, and these hashes are about 64 characters long. If you get a hash that has an output that starts with 5 zeros, then you win the puzzle. You are the winner. You get your $400,000. Okay. And it is that process of hashing the information over and over and over again and trying to find 5 zeros. And so you say, how can you just hash the same thing over and over again? Why would the output change? What happens is they put extra information. It's called a nonce. Okay. So if you have the information of 5 transactions and that doesn't hash into what you're looking for, then you add a letter to it and do it again and see if you get 5. And you do that billions and billions and billions and billions of times until just randomly you end up with the winner. It's like winning the lottery. Like you play it enough times, you're going to win. And that activity is called mining. And just to finish it out, the reason that this is super, super important is because the rule in Bitcoin is the chain of hashes that is the longest, which means has been added to by the most successful miners. That's what everybody assumes is valid. Okay. And here's the magic. The reason that that's valid is because the only way that a longer chain could be created that is not valid or is dishonest is if dishonest people had more computers than honest people. Because if you want to put invalid transactions in the chain, you can do it, but you have to have so much computing power that you're building these blocks faster than everybody else. You're winning this puzzle faster than everybody else. So long as more than 50% of the computing power that goes into Bitcoin is not bad people, then we can trust it. And it's brilliant. This was the innovation that Satoshi came up with in 2008. It's very hard to understand, right? I'm just telling it to you now because, we had to talk about the simplest stuff first, but this is why it's worth $1.2 trillion. So I would go by everybody, learn about hashing, learn about hash functions, and then connect the dots and learn like how you mine and what you need, what the puzzle is in order to get the mining reward, the block reward, and you'll understand. Thank you for a great question. All these questions are so good. I'm really impressed with you guys.
Thank you.
Yes, these are middle school students. They're really invested. They want to know. And when they go to the debates, they produce really quality questions and quality statements to their audience. And that's why they're so highly respected when they go out into these contests, because they really make the effort. Professor Hadden, we're just really grateful that you took the time to spend with us. And these students are kind of the best of the best among some of the middle schoolers that we have, and that their peers are also going to be watching the follow-up video. And a lot of them, there were a lot of people in here that had come and gone. And so these are the ones who have the true dedication. They stay till the very end to get all the questions answered and listen to everyone. So anyway, so just one last time, we just wave and say thank you to everybody. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Really appreciate this. This is wonderful. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.